A Guten Erev Shabbos. Things seem upside down, topsy-turvy, not what we would have expected. That's the way the world looks. That's the way the Parsha looks. Let's examine each and then look at them together and listen to their message. These last few weeks have been unnerving, to put it delicately. We all have family in Israel. Some of us have brothers and sisters, but really, all of us have brothers and sisters. Politics and society is complicated in Israel, as contrasted with the rest of the world where everything is simple and transparent and easy to predict. But it is complicated still further by those in Israel's part of the world who more or less have had a difficult time accepting the fact that Israel is there at all, much less that it's able and willing to defend itself. Various groups have adopted different strategies. Fight with Israel with all your might was one strategy for a long time, until some adversaries figured out that they could get more from Israel at the bargaining table than they could ever achieve on the battlefield, and they were correct. Thankfully, we've seen a progression of nations willing to swallow their pride and their rhetoric and accept Israel as a reality, some formally, some less formally, some in public view, some still behind the scenes. But this strategy of, to put it simply, kill the Jews, always popular throughout the centuries, never really completely went away. It's sad to think, but at the same time, it's probably wise to think that it never goes away completely. Sometimes it lies dormant for a while, and it can always spring to life in the bat of an eyelash. And that's what we've seen in the last few weeks. It's very disheartening if we let it be. What we should not do is let it get us down. We have enough to worry about without concerning ourselves too much about disproportionate force in Israel's conflicts, or, as some see it, we're supposed to feel bad because not enough Jews are dying. Sorry, we've filled our quota. Thanks very much. We did not need even a miniature 10 or 11-day war in Gaza to remind us that things are not right in the world. We're well into our second year now of pandemic living, separation, isolation, quarantine. Plans we made were shelved, events and trips were canceled, graduations and celebrations postponed, and too much TV watching indulged in. It hasn't been much fun. On the other hand, we discovered Zoom. We did contact people we'd lost touch with. There are silver linings, I suppose. But for the most part, much about our lives has been upside down and backwards for the past 15 months. And only now does there seem to be some hope for change on the horizon, but it seems no one's getting their hopes up too high quite yet. Rarely are things so upside down and backwards as they are in the middle of our Torah portion this week, Parshas Behaalosecha. It's a very powerful parsha with its image at the opening of Aharon HaKohen lighting the menorah in the Mishkan at the beginning. Later, his descendants would light that menorah for 8 centuries in the temple in Yerushalayim. At the beginning of the 6th aliyah of this week's Sedra, that's chapter 10 of Numbers, verse 35 and 36, there's a unique marker in the text. Most Chumashim printed, as they should, because believe it or not, it's actually written this way in the Sefer Torah. The scroll of the Torah has these 2 verses marked as no other passage is marked, with the letter Nun written larger than normal before and after those 2 verses. And the 2 nuns are upside down and backwards. It's in the Art Scroll editions, it's in the Koran, even the good old Hertz Chumash has it that way. Nowhere else in the Chumash do you have such a strange thing as these 2 nuns printed upside down and backwards. What's going on here? Obviously, it must be telling us that there's something quite special about this brief 2-verse passage. First of all, what are the 2 psukim that are so special that they deserve this distinction? One of them you know by heart. Let's sing it together. Vayihi b'neso Aharon, vayomer Moshe, Kuma Hashem, veyafutzu oyevecha, veyanusu misanecha mipanecha. Sounds familiar, right? When the ark would travel, it says, Moshe would say, "Arise, O God, and let your foes be scattered. Let those who despise you flee from before you." We sing it each time we open the Aron HaKodesh to take out the Torah. Many of us haven't been in a shul in a painfully long time. So when's the last time we sang that as a kehillah? You're right, we have to fix that. So this week, as you're reviewing the parsha, you can sing it out loud, sing it proud when you get to that passage. The second verse is also part of our regular davening. Uvanucho Yomar, when we put away the Sefer Torah, right after Hashem Oz Le'amo Yitein Hashem Yevarech Es Amo V'Shalom on Shabbos, and a weekday right after Se'u Sha'arim. I'm not going to bother you with my singing of that. You can sing it yourself. We don't necessarily sing, but we do say this verse, Uvanucho Yomar, when the ark rested, he, Moshe, would say, Shuva Hashem Rivavois Alfei Yisrael, return, O God, to the myriad thousands of Israel. On the face of it, there must be something very special to be designated in this unique way. The simplest explanation given is that these two verses are actually out of place. That's it, plain and simple. They're talking about the Holy Ark going in front of the Jewish people, and that really belongs 50 paragraphs earlier. By the way, Nun is equal to 50 in Jewish numerology. So they belong 50 paragraphs earlier in Parshas Bamidbar, chapter 2, the beginning of this whole book, where the Torah explains the formation of Machane Yisrael, the Israelite camp, as we traveled through the desert. So says Rabbeinu Bachya. So why not put them in their proper place, leave them where they belong? These out-of-place verses were inserted in this particular spot to make a separation between two not-so-positive incidents. The verses which preceded, just before, which say, Vayisu mehar Hashem derech shloshes yamim, that we left Mount Sinai. After giving of the Torah, we left Mount Sinai where God spoke to us, and we traveled for 3 days straight. Not so flattering to talk about how we headed away from an encounter with Hashem and ran for 3 days straight. Okay, doesn't sound so nice. And the verses which come after, which are also not so nice, they discuss the mitonanim, the Jews who complained. I know, give yourself a moment to imagine that. Jews who complained in the desert that things weren't good enough for them. You know how the old Jewish complaint, the food is terrible and the portions are so small. So the Torah doesn't want us to read two unflattering incidents one after another, so these verses come in between to sort of break up the flow of the story. By the way, Rabbi Shimon Gamliel says in the Gemara in Shabbos that in days to come, when all negativity is no more, these two verses will be moved to their proper place earlier in the Chumash, in the Sefer. Tosfos says that this passage, this two-verse passage, is actually the Tfilas HaDerech of the Bnei Yisrael as we go out to battle. They davened for Hashem's help and victory using these words. Nowadays, Tfilas HaDerech, the traveler's prayer, the wayfarer's prayer, it's called in your Siddur, that we say whenever we set out for a trip. Hopefully soon we'll be setting out on trips again. It's a collection of different verses, but this is the way they used it in those days. Another explanation says that Anshe Knesset Hagadola decreed that these two nuns, these two upside-down nuns that surround the passage in question, hinted to the nefila, nun for nefila, fall, of the first and the second temples. They're put here with these inspiring verses to give us hope to look forward to the temple's ultimate restoration. There's actually a staggering suggestion made by some of the commentators. We touched on this briefly in one of our shiurim this week, that in fact these two verses set off by the upside down backwards nuns constitute an entire separate book of the Torah. Earth-shattering. Here we've been talking about the Chumash, about 5 books of Torah, and they're making an argument that in fact there are 7 books of Torah. Wild. Genesis, let's count them off, see if I have 7 fingers. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, up till chapter 10, verse 34. That's 4 books, right? This little separate book itself, 2 verses marked by the upside-down backwards nuns, is book number 5. The remainder of Numbers, another 35 chapters, is 6. And Deuteronomy, 7. 7 books in Torah at all. Okay, fascinating to think about. King Solomon, Shlomo HaMelech, talks about 7 pillars of wisdom in his book of Proverbs. Maybe he meant this. The number 7 is also what opens the Parsha this week. 7 lights on the menorah that Aharon lights in the Mishkan. 7 obviously has a lot of significance in the natural world. 7 days of the week. 7 years of the Shemitah agricultural cycle. We'll speak more about that in weeks to come. Also 7 strings on King David's harp, and the annual cycle of festivals, the holidays, are officially 7 days long. Right? That's what the Torah says. As a bonus or comfort for living outside of Israel, we get to have an extra day of celebration. But the Torah mandates 7 days of rejoicing, 7 days of Chag for Sukkot and Pesach. The mystical, spiritual trend in Jewish thought talks about 7 emotional attributes. We just said each one of them 7 times in counting 7 weeks of the Omer, just a few weeks back. Those 7 are further distinguished as 5 that have to do with self-refinement and 2 that have to do with refining the world, the way we encounter it. So in this schema, this way of thinking, there's a 5-based view of things and a 7-based view of things, which actually happens to dovetail very nicely with what comes up in the following chapters and parshas that we're reading this week and going to read in weeks to come. There is the rebellion of the spies, Parsha Shalach. There's Korach, the complainers amongst the Bnei Yisrael who say that the food here isn't good, and oh, how good we had it back in Egypt, back when we were slaves. They clearly forgot part of the story. This 7-based view of things, as that's suggested by this view of the Torah as 7 books, says that there's potential even to deal with, to engage somehow or other positively, rebellion and complaint, which are very low states of being, to take those and lift them up to a higher purpose also. Again, in the times that we're going through with the burden of isolation and the fear and frustration of violence on Israel's borders, we really need all the hope we can everything we can hold on to deal with taking discouraging situations and finding the good in them. There's a very nice explanation that Me'am Lois brings from his teachers. He says, where else do we have 2 very important nuns? I'm still stuck on this idea of the 2 nuns. So Me'am Lois says, Nase v'nishma, we will do and we will understand. That was our motto, remember, at Mount Sinai. We accepted the Torah, Nase v'nishma. After we do what it says, we'll follow, we'll do our best to understand. The doing precedes the understanding. The Gemara in Shabbos, page 88a, says in the name of Rabbi Simlai that when we put the we will do before we will hear, there were 60 myriads of angels that came to each and every Jew and put 2 crowns on our heads. 1 crown for Naaseh, we will do, and 1 crown for Nishma, we will hear, which is actually a pretty beautiful image. So Naaseh v'nishma is in some sense our national motto that inspires us and encourages us. If so, the question is, what are they doing here and why upside down and backwards? To suggest that in this 3-day running away from Sinai that we mentioned before, we should remember who we are and what it is that we do. There are times when we get discouraged, we get depressed, we get disheartened. Maybe there was a feeling in those times with all the Jews grousing about quail and all those things. Maybe there's something that resonates with our times when Jews get very down on what's going to happen to shuls, what's going to happen to Jewish communities, when will those mean nations stop picking on us and picking on Israel and leave us alone. You know that some of the newspapers in the U.S. reported this week that Jewish organizations there were thinking about removing or hiding the Magen David or other obviously Jewish symbols on the outside of their buildings, the Jewish community buildings, the Mount Sinai hospitals, that have a Star of David on them, because it's a known fact that if you just remove your outward symbols, if you take off your Jewish star necklace or you take your yarmulke off, suddenly non-Jews will not be able to tell that you're Jewish. Did you know that? Fun fact. Anyway, the 2 nuns here in our parsha are to remind us of that and to inspire us. Vayehi b'nesoah ha'aron, vayomer Moshe. When we go out with the Ark of Torah leading the way for us, Moshe says, Kuma Hashem v'yafutzu oivecha. Hashem arises and our enemies scatter. That's the way you move forward in this world. Sfas Emes says very nicely on this issue. He says, note that Vayehi b'nesoah is moving. And the second verse, Uvenucho yomar, that's resting. This is like 6 days of the week and Shabbos. Most of the time we're moving, we're headed in a direction. And it's a little bit harder to see the concealed wonders of Hashem. When we come to rest on Shabbos and everything's calm and peaceful and still, it's easier to appreciate Hashem's wonders, what's going on around us. The goal, the ultimate goal, is to be able to see and appreciate all the time, not just when we're standing still, but even when we're moving, to know that Hashem is with us and leading us and protecting us all the time. The Nesivos Shalom comments on our parsha quite astutely. He said this parsha, and indeed this whole book of Bamidbar, book of Numbers, is a description of how Bnei Yisrael journeyed through the desert. He says simply, we should realize we're all always on a journey. even when we live in the same house, in the same city, year after year. That's not really what it's all about. We're really all on a journey. Some of it's national, some of it's individual, personal. So we should simply recognize that moment when we take out the Torah, or these weeks when we're davening at home and we aren't even taking out the Torah. First of all, someone somewhere is taking out a Torah. And second of all, in this week's Parsha, every Jew everywhere is reading these verses. Vayehi b'nesoah ha'aron. That moment is like the actual going forth of the entire Jewish people, with the Ark of the Covenant before us, leading our way and lighting our path. And Vayomer Moshe, not only do we hear the voice of Moses saying that our enemies are going to scatter, we ourselves have a spark of Moshe within us. And wherever we go with Torah leading our way, so too our foes will scatter in awe. This will lead to the true peace that we're so eagerly anticipating and so much looking forward to. Please God, may it surprise us by how soon it arrives. Shabbat Shalom.